So hello, my name is Austin Byrne-Jones. I am the presenter at The Body Curious, and today this is part 3 of the 6-part series of lectures on health, all about fat, your BFF, your best friend forever. And so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to recap for those that missed little bits of it from last week. If you want to refer back to the previous stuff, then just simply go to thebodycurious.co.uk and you can pick up the previous lectures on that website. Okay, so we're going to start off with what I tend to call the heart disease paradox. And what I've said before is this idea about cholesterol. Now, I've sort of laboured the point about whether cholesterol is actually a risk or not. And the basic question really is cholesterol a risk factor in heart disease? And the simple answer to that is yes, it is. However, so does having hairy earlobes. I'm not even kidding here. Also baldness, snoring, being short, and strangely, being rich in a poor country, and also 200 other risk factors. And so what we're saying here is that when we're hearing this in the media about that cholesterol is a risk factor for heart disease, they're giving you well out of context. Is that a risk factor does not mean cause at all. You know, so I'm sorry, but I think I've got hairy earlobes. Does this mean I've got heart disease? No, you really do have to have a good portion of these other 200 risk factors before you can then sort of say, oh, well, okay, maybe there is a risk of heart disease. So if we get back to the basics of the facts of this, and I'm recapping from sort of combining the previous two, we'll spend just a couple of minutes on this, is that the facts of these: does plaque contribute to heart disease? Again, the simple answer to that, out of context, is yes. Does plaque have cholesterol in it? Well, technically, yes, it does. Will a statin lower my cholesterol? Technically, yes. Cholesterol, that is what statins are built to do. They do lower your cholesterol. And is too much fat bad for me? Well, yes. Technically, it is. However, there are other facts here. Does eating fat cause heart disease? No, it does not. Does high cholesterol mean I have heart disease? No, it does not. Well, what about good and bad cholesterol? Well, for those of you here last week, I've already proved to you that no, this is just complete nonsense. The answer is no. It is nonsense, this whole good and bad cholesterol argument. It's silly. And what about saturated fat? No, this is, again, nonsense. And if you don't believe me right this second, go back to the other 2 lectures. So if we're all happy with that, then we'll move forward with the rest of this, the part 3. Okay, so we've got a growing epidemic of obesity in the Western world. We know this, nobody's denying that this is a fact. We can see it. Okay, however, now, what is interesting is we have the stats on this. Okay, so in the 1960s and 70s, about 13% of the population in the Western world were reckoned to be obese adults. This is okay. By the 1980s, this had dramatically gone up to 22%, and then by 1990, we now have 25% of adult Americans are obese. Okay, and that's growing exponentially. So something is going wrong, okay? Now, what is interesting, okay, well, what about elsewhere in the world? Well, what's interesting when we come to saturated fat as an example is people in northern India, okay, they consume 17 times more animal fat, but actually have a lower incidence of coronary heart disease, 7 times lower, in fact, than the people of southern India, because of the differential. They consume far more animal fat than those in the south. You also have the inhabitants of the island of Okinawa in Japan, and they have one of the highest average lifespans of women. It's about 84 years old, and they eat pork and seafood and do all their cooking in lard, and yet they have hardly any heart disease, and their average lifespan is 84. Okay. So this idea, again, that saturated fat is somehow bad for us doesn't actually pan out in the real world. If you remember, I quoted the Pima Indians versus the Eskimos and the Maasai of Kenya as a fine example of where traditional cultures, depending on what you eat, again, the argument about saturated fat and cholesterol does not stack up, whereas cultures like Pima Indians having grains and cereals in their diet, they're all obese. Now, we also take, say, in Europe, we have the Swiss, and they have one of the highest intakes of saturated fat in the world, and yet they also have one of the highest average lifespans. So it's not simply about disease, or, okay, what about heart disease? What about in terms of, do we live longer if we do this? And the answer is yes. We also have the French. Now, we all know, if you've ever been to France, is that you can consume huge amounts of saturated fats. You've got the butter and the cream and the eggs, have livers and pâtés, all really high in saturated fats and cholesterol. And yet they actually, from a European point of view, they have a fairly low occurrence of coronary heart disease compared to the rest of us. Any questions so far? No? Okay. So we also have data studies from 21 studies, data from 21 studies that included 348,000 adults, and found that there was no difference in the risk of heart disease and stroke between people with the lowest or the highest intakes of saturated fat. Okay? So we can then look at brain fat. Long John, yes, welcome. However, I would suggest that this is the whole point of go back to the other 2 lectures and you'll find that no, fat is not evil. But welcome anyway. Okay, so you've got brain fat. Well, you've got the brain is made of predominantly water, fat, and cholesterol. This is how our brain works. This is what it relies on in terms of nutrient, okay? And 80% of that fat in the brain is saturated. So what exactly is fat? For those of you who got Zoom, you can see this slide here. Do you have six-packs related to fat? That's to do with fitness. That's not necessarily related to fat. However, if you want to be able to heal better, if you have a six-pack, it's really important to make sure you have the correct amount of fat. Yeah? Okay. No, it's actually a type of muscle. Okay, so the good, the bad, and the ugly, or rather, should I say the good, the good, and the ugly. Okay, so for those of you on Zoom, you can see this slide, and we can see that you have what is the shape of fat. You know, this is sort of, we're getting to the nitty gritty now. Okay, everybody's banging on about fat and there's supposedly good and bad fats and everything else. So I use this basic ruling: is if food, whatever nutrients you're having, okay, if it would have looked like food to the caveman, then the chances are it's still food now. If it would have not have been recognizable as food by the caveman, the chances are it probably isn't. And it's a good rule of thumb, I tend to think of. And this is where saturated fat and unsaturated fats are perfectly fine. There is nothing wrong with them, okay? In the right balance, we're talking about you need approximately a 50-50 balance of saturated fat to unsaturated fat in your diet, okay? And that's fine. However, the bad guy is the trans fat. That means the fake fat, the fat that's actually been trying to mimic one of the other fats, and we can give quotes of things like, say, margarine or shortenings. These are the easiest ones to spot. And the shape of them, as you can see on Zoom, is that you have a saturated fat, and it quite literally means it's saturated with hydrogen atoms. It's unbendy, which means, and you can recognize a saturated fat at room temperature because it's solid at room temperature. Yeah. Whereas an unsaturated fat is liquid at room temperature. And this is the quick and easy way of spotting a saturated versus unsaturated fat. However, the bad guys in this picture are a type of, basically they started life off as an unsaturated fat, as in nice and bendy, because unsaturated means quite literally they are not saturated with hydrogen. And what's happened, they've done something called hydrogenation. And that means they are quite literally, the manufacturers are bombarding an unsaturated bendy fat with hydrogen. And so it mimics or pretends to be a saturated fat. In other words, it remains roughly solid at room temperature. Unfortunately, the body doesn't actually recognize it very well. And this is why it causes problems. And as I've already explained in the previous lectures, is one of the key problems with some of the data that was collected that sent us up the garden path was that they saw no difference between trans fats, in other words, those fake saturated fats, and natural saturated fat. Okay? And we now know that this is not the case. So one of the other rather more surprising things is that recently our governments have actually agreed that any amount of trans fats is not actually healthy for us. However, they still continue to be under this bizarre impression that they still don't distinguish the difference between a trans fat and a saturated fat. So on the tablet we have, for those on Zoom, you can see the differences of the effects it actually has on the body. So under normal circumstances, the effect that saturated fat has on cell membranes, as an example, saturated fats are actually essential for healthy function of those cell membranes. However, trans fats actually interfere with healthy function of cell membranes. We then look at the hormones. Again, as we said before, all these steroidal hormones, in other words, the sex hormones basically, need cholesterol to function, and actually saturated fats are actually, they enhance hormone production. However, strangely enough, or unsurprisingly, trans fats, they interfere with hormone production. Inflammation, saturated fats actually suppress inflammation in our system, whereas trans fats actually encourage it. And then we have the thing with regards to heart disease. Remember, I was talking about heart disease, the heart disease paradox. We now know, or rather we've actually known for at least 2 decades now, that one of the best markers really for heart disease is something called LPA, lipoprotein A, which has got nothing to do with cholesterol at all. However, what we know about this is that saturated fat in our diet actually helps lower the chances of our body producing this stuff called LPA, which is the best marker we have of heart disease. Whereas, interestingly enough, trans fats actually increase the causation or chances of getting LPA in our system. So we've got something like omega-3. Everybody bangs on about omega-3. Okay, now that's actually, we actually need saturated fats to hold on to omega-3. This is the sort of the whole sort of daftness of it, because, oh, what about omega-3 oils? It's, well, the thing is, your body actually can't hold on to omega-3 without the presence of saturated fats in the first place. And actually, trans fats, because they're not proper saturated fat, the body can't actually hold on to omega-3s with that. Now, interestingly enough, with regards to something like diabetes, saturated fat has been shown to help insulin receptors, which is really important. Diabetes, we tend to think of it as being a sugar problem, whereas actually you could actually see it in a different way and call it an insulin insensitivity problem. And so actually the consumption of saturated fats helps with the reception or the receptors for insulin recognition, whereas, interestingly enough, trans fats actually inhibit those receptors of insulin. Saturated fats help the immune system, whereas trans fats depress it. And then we have something called prostaglandins, and they actually, saturated fats again encourage the production and balance of prostaglandins, whereas trans fats, they depress that production, and they also cause imbalances. So this is one of the key points, is to know the difference between saturated fat and trans fats, those fake fats. That means margarines. Okay, plain and simple. So basically, the difference between what the difference is between a good and a bad fat actually isn't to do with its chemical structure, whether it's saturated or unsaturated, but actually its shape. Yeah. So we can look at the benefits of saturated fat. So again, with cell membranes, you should have approximately 50% saturated fatty acids within the cell membranes for them to function well. You also need saturated fat to help the body put calcium in the bones. I know it seems unlikely, but actually this is the case. This is what your body needs saturated fat for. Yeah. In terms of saturated fats for the heart, it's actually the preferred food for your heart, in fact. Interestingly enough, you also have saturated fats, and they actually protect your liver from things like, say, alcohol or other types of toxins or poisons. And then you have lungs function. Okay, your lungs actually can't function without the presence of saturated fats. Again, kidneys can't function without saturated fats. The immune system, it enhances it. The saturated fats enhances the body's ability to fight infection. And you have all the essential fatty acids, and they work together with saturated fats. Yeah. And one of the key things that I bang on about is your body's ability to detox that is one of the key components of how your body gets rid of toxins is fats. They are your friend. Yeah. If you're going to go on a detox diet, you seriously need a good intake of clean, good quality, saturated fats. Saturated fats, what are they? Why are they so important? Well, they are highly stable things, okay, because they're filled with all these hydrogen atoms, okay, they've got these carbon atom linkages. Is not important, this is the chemical stuff, okay, and they don't normally go rancid, is because they're so solid and saturated. There's no place for oxygenation, if you like, okay, so that's why they're so good for cooking at high temperatures, as an example. And this is why, again, they're solid or semi-solid at room temperature. This is how you know a saturated fat. Now, your body actually makes saturated fatty acids from the carbohydrates, and they are then found in animal fats and tropical oils, okay? And your body requires saturated fat. Now, the difference between that and, say, monounsaturated and polyunsaturated. Now, monounsaturated fats, again, they are unsaturated, so they are bendy. In other words, liquid at room temperature. Again, they're quite stable and generally do not go rancid that easily. So quite a few of these, such as, say olive oil, which contains something called oleic acid, they're okay for being able to cook with about once or twice max before they start to actually break down. Yeah. And so oleic acid, which is the active component within good quality monounsaturated fats, things like olive oil, you've also got almonds, pecans, cashews, peanuts, and avocados. Yeah. So, and then you've got the polyunsaturated fats. Now this means they've actually got 4 or more spaces, and that means they're very bendy. In other words, they're usually always liquid, even when cold. Okay, now that means because they've got lots of spaces, and they can go rancid very easily. Okay, and this is what we call, say, something like omega-6. That is a triple unsaturated, a double unsaturated type of polyunsaturated fat known as linoleic acid. And then we have something called omega-3, which everybody knows about. And again, that's a triple unsaturated linolenic acid. Okay, so this is why omega-3 requires a saturated fat to be held onto, because it goes off very easily. It is very unstable. You can't expose omega-3 oils to heat of any kind. Okay, this is why you need to keep those types of things. If you're taking, I know, something like an Udo's oil, as an example, you need to keep it in the fridge to help it remain stable. It goes rancid very easily. And again, none of these types of polyunsaturated fats should be used for cooking. So you've got about 5 different types of saturated fats that we encounter. You've got something called butyric acid, lauric acid, caprylic acid, palmitic acid, and stearic acid. Okay. Now, interestingly enough, between them, they do some marvelous things with regards to our body. In the case of butyric acid, it is a modulator of genetic regulation, so it keeps our genes basically stable. You've got lauric acid, and that's an anti-plaque and antifungal, as in terms of arterial plaque. You've got something called caprylic acid, and that's a natural antiviral and antifungal. And then you've got palmitic and stearic acid, both of which lower supposedly cholesterol, if that's what you want to happen. Although rather I tend to say it helps modulate cholesterol, to be quite honest. So even though there's more than about a dozen different types, generally speaking, human beings, we tend to only really encounter it, generally speaking, in three forms, and that's the stearic and palmitic acid, and also something called lauric acid, which we encounter within things like dairy. Okay. What's interesting about stearic acid is that it has no adverse effects on cholesterol, and it also, interestingly, also gets converted in the liver into oleic acid, which is that monounsaturated fat that we find within olive oil. But the body does it by itself. It creates its own proper balance. Now, as I mentioned before, saturated fat actually is required for calcium to be effectively incorporated into the bone. And what's interesting is that Dr. Mary Enid, PhD, as I've mentioned before, she says, there is a case to be made for having as much as 50% of the fats in your diet as saturated for this very reason. So when we're thinking about, say, something like osteoporosis, which is very common in women, is it because women, generally speaking, are far more concerned about their weight, and they have been basically hoodwinked into this idea of consuming no saturated fat for so many years that there has quite literally been an explosion of osteoporosis? Is it because actually it's because they're not consuming enough saturated fat? And I'll repeat again and again, and I say this at least 2 or 3 times within each of my lectures, eating fat does not make you fat. It's the sugar that makes you fat. Saturated fat does not make you fat. So in terms of, say, the lungs, now I said your lungs can't actually operate without the presence of saturated fat. And this is because within the lungs, you actually have a coating of what's called a lung surfactant. In other words, it allows the body to breathe in, breathe out all the time. It's a lubricant, and that lubricant is 100% saturated fatty acids. What's interesting, though, is you start to introduce trans fats into there, and actually interferes with that surfactant production. Okay, and it, in essence, it causes breathing difficulties. So it's giving your kids, say, margarines, one of the reasons why we have such an endemic case, practically endemic as far as I'm concerned, of asthma occurring in our children. Being introduced to things that the body just doesn't need to encounter. Now, we also know that saturated fat has been shown to protect the liver from alcohol and other types of medications, including amphetamines and other drugs commonly used for pain and arthritis. Yeah. Again, as I said before, omega-3 fatty acids are actually better retained in the tissues when the diet is rich in saturated fats. Yeah. They are also, saturated fats are also the preferred foods for the heart, in particular stearic acid and palmitic acid. Okay, and that's why you should have plenty of fat surrounding the heart. Yeah, and that's a good thing. Okay. So what's also interesting is research has shown that when women diet, those eating the greatest percentage of total fat in their diet as saturated fat actually lose the most weight, which of course is inverse of what a lot of people think. And again, we have Elefthera Maratos-Fleer, and she's a director of obesity research at Harvard Joslin Diabetes Center, and she says, for 30 to 40% of the population, low-fat diets are actually counterproductive. They have the paradoxical effect of making people gain weight. Again, it's not this lunatic here that's saying this. There's plenty of people have been saying this type of stuff. I've been saying it for 7 years, and there have been a variety of PhDs, doctors of various different expertise, all have been saying the same thing, but we haven't been heard. Yeah. The tide is turning, though, finally. Okay. So what's also interesting, those who remain on a fat-free diet for any length of time develop a variety of health problems, including low energy, difficulty in concentration, depression, weight gain, and mineral deficiencies. The evidence is overwhelming. So I love these pictures here for those of you on Zoom. Lard is not your enemy. I'm going to get into specifics now. Okay, so it was sort of dumped in the 1920s as being, oh, lard, we can't possibly have that. Now, obviously, for those of you who might be vegans or vegetarians, obviously this is of no interest to you at all. However, those of you who aren't, lard has got a plethora of really useful properties to it that are really important for our immune system. What's interesting again is as soon as we get into the food chain, it also very much depends on the quality of life the animal has experienced. So we can actually spot this within the nature of the fat. So actually, when you're actually looking at the quality of the fat that you get from your lard, you've got a fairly good idea of actually the type of health that those piggies have had. Now, there's been quite a lot of stuff in the press recently about pig welfare. And what's interesting is depending on what you, surprisingly, depending on what you give it to eat, it will reflect on the quality of the fat you get out of it. Again, it's part of the food chain. Something like 25% or more of all antibiotics sold in the UK actually are to farmers or are to pig farmers. It's insane. We're actually managing to get people to not take quite so many antibiotics ourselves, and yet it's actually, there's more and more going into the food chain. Crazy. And what makes you think it's not coming back towards us? We're the ones eating that. So what's interesting about lard, it actually contains 14% of the saturated fat called stearic acid, okay? And that's been shown clinically to modulate your cholesterol. Now, what's also interesting about lard, it actually contains 44% of that oleic acid. So actually it's not totally saturated fat at all. We tend to think of it as being totally saturated fat, whereas actually it's almost the perfect balance. And the perfect balance, in terms of from our body's point of view, is pretty much something like breast milk. Now, breast milk is about 48% saturated and 45% unsaturated fat, okay? It's the perfect balance dietary-wise for the growing baby, and as far as we're concerned, actually, as adults, we should be having about 50%-ish of saturated or unsaturated fat. And what's interesting about lard, it is pretty close. It's 42% saturated and 54% unsaturated. So fantastically, from a nutritional point of view, the perfect balance of something that we need. So you've also got, so now lard or pork fat, basically, that's what lard is. Okay, now that's, as we said, we've got about 48% monounsaturated, which is this palmitoleic acid, okay, which is antimicrobial, and 12% polyunsaturated, but the rest, the other 40%, is saturated. So really good for cooking. Now, what's interesting, again, when we come to the health of the pigs in the first place, now, you also get both omega-6 and omega-3 fatty acids in pork lard, but it will vary very considerably on what has been fed to the pigs in its life. So we tend to think of omega-3 as only being to do with fish, but actually it's most sort of living animals have omega-3 in them. But we forget about this. It's only as soon as you start getting industrial about things. Omega-3 is one of these interesting types of fats. It's because it's so unstable in animals, and this includes humans. We have omega-3 in ourselves. It gets depleted when you're stressed, and this applies to the pigs or the cows or anything else. As if they have a stressful lifestyle, their omega-3 levels, and in fact their B vitamin levels, actually deplete. Okay, so stress has a direct effect on the food you're eating. So if you've got stressed piggies that have been stressed out of their minds, guess what? They're nutritionally not going to be much good to you either. And this can be found directly in the fats. However, if you happen to be a vegetarian, so say in the tropics, the pigs may well have been fed on coconuts. So actually what's interesting, you will actually have a fairly high content of lauric acid in there, because coconut oil is a good quality saturated fat that contains plenty of lauric acid. So again, really important to check what you're actually eating. Makes sense, I know, but yes, I have a question. Yes, ask away. I'm being asked a question on Periscope, by the way, for those of you listening on Zoom. How to lose fat. Okay, so one of the quickest and simplest ways, and I mentioned this on our first lecture on health back to basics, so do have a look on thebodycurious.co.uk and the first lecture, which is called Health Back to Basics. We talk about the simple way of losing weight. Is that, as far as I'm concerned, the easiest way to lose weight, if that's what we're talking about, not necessarily getting fitter, not necessarily getting healthier, but simply to lose weight, the fastest and easiest way, as far as I'm concerned, is to basically cut out fruit and cut out alcohol, because they are both sugars, and as I've said before, it actually bypasses the glycogen mechanism in the body and just gets saved as fat. So if we're just simply talking about losing fat, then we're looking at, or losing weight in that way, and that's the simplest and quickest way. That does not necessarily mean to say that that either fruit or alcohol is bad for you. It's just simply a case of, if actually what we're looking for is to lose weight specifically, and then actually we need to reduce our sugar intake. This is why Atkins was so close on the money with a lot of his stuff. However, if we're simply talking about that, then the quickest and fastest way, as far as I'm concerned, is cut out alcohol, cut out fruit, and the pounds will basically fall off. That doesn't mean to say you eat lots of other things too, but that is the easiest way without going on some kind of radical diet. Okay, so back to, I hope that answers your question there quickly, but what I'd say is go to the website and look at the first lecture we did on health back to basics, and then also look at the previous two lectures on this specific thing, which is all about fat and cholesterol, and this is part 3. Okay, so where was I? Lauric acid, yes. So it's really important to, at this point now, is that we've talked about sort of the sort of biochemistry of fat and cholesterol, and now I'm sort of getting into, you know, we need to get a little bit more savvy with regards to what we're eating, because there are different forms, and if you don't know what you're eating, then it doesn't help you. You know, and I will say again, I repeat myself over and again on this, is that saturated fat, or rather, sorry, there is no system in the human body that does not rely on the nutrition you give it. It's really important. What does that nutrition mean? Nutrition isn't just simply about food. It's about food. It's about what you put in your mouth, what you see, what you hear. Your environment is everything. There is nothing that is not affected by what goes in. The fact that we think we're somehow defended by something is that we forget that actually, and this will be one of the other lectures I'll be doing on this, is on digestion, we forget that our skin is part of our digestive system. We tend to think of digestion as simply being about our stomach, and it's not. There are so many aspects of digestion, even something simple as the eyes, the way the eyes cleanse the blood because of when it's exposed to ultraviolet light. This is why sunlight itself is so good for us. Okay, so getting back to lard. Yes, now, when we talk about lard, we tend to refer to lard, generally speaking, as being pork fat. And there is a difference between different types of lards. Over here in the UK, we tend to say, okay, lard, that's pork fat. However, sometimes we tend to refer to beef lard as being either beef dripping or beef tallow. Okay, so but quite often when you're saying I want some lard, it's actually useful to specify what type of fat you want. Okay, so so you can have had different types of lard, some of which may be pork, some of which will be beef, some of which will be mutton, and they all have a different quantity of saturated to unsaturated type fats in it. So therefore they have certain types of benefits to them that the other ones don't have. Some of them, they'll actually come as a mixture. Okay, so, but it's, if you want to get really picky about it, it's useful to, first of all, find out what type of fat you're buying and from what animal, and how those animals have been reared, because it makes a lot of difference of the nutritional value of the fat you're having. And this is really important because just in the same as in human beings, fat is a thing that protects you from toxins. But if you're eating a fat that actually is from an animal that's been exposed to lots of toxins, all you're simply doing is putting more toxins in your system. So it's really important to have good quality, clean type fats. Yeah. So you've got beef and mutton tallow as an example. They contain about 50 to 55% saturated fat. And they contain 40% monounsaturated, those are oleic acids, similar to, say, olive oil. And then you have a very small amount of polyunsaturates, as opposed to, say, the pork fat, which has got slightly more polyunsaturates. And then you have marvellous suet. If everyone ever had a suet pudding, it's rare these days because people are so afraid of saturated fat, and particularly suet, you don't often see it. However, what's interesting is because it comes from the cavity of the animal, it's a superb source of saturated fat. In fact, suet contains between 70 to 80% saturated fat, incredibly stable at very high temperatures. That's what it's really used to. It is really useful for frying, and you can use it over and over again. I have suet in our in a deep fat fryer. Okay, and we can use it over and over again. Okay. So, and what's interesting about this is that something like suet in traditional cultures, it's actually the highest price fat there is, and it's a really good source of antimicrobial palmitoleic acid. Okay. So it's coming up to 7 minutes past 8, and we'll finish around about 10 past 8. Today. So I'll just wrap up with regards to the animal fats here, and we'll move on part 4 with what to do about it. Okay, so you've got things like duck and goose fat. Now I happen to like duck and goose fat for roasting potatoes because, again, they're mainly saturated and they make really good crispy potatoes. Okay, now potatoes, yes, I know they're sugar, and those are the things that will make you fat. The goose fat doesn't make you fat on make you fat. It's the potatoes that do. Yeah. So duck and goose fat, now they're semi-solid at room temperature. Okay, so they're about 35% saturated fat, and the rest is about 52% monounsaturated and 13% polyunsaturated. Okay, so they're pretty decent for a one-time use at high temperatures. Okay. And again, once again, with regards to the duck and goose fat, the proportion of omega-6 and omega-3 fatty acids that's contained within duck and goose fat does very much depend on what those birds have eaten. Yeah. And then, of course, we've got the other types of saturated fat that's non-animal based, so something like, say, coconut oil or other tropical type oils, which are consumed by some of the indigenous populations. They protect them from bacteria and fungus in their food. Thank you for the heart, by the way. Now, what is interesting, as a lot of these indigenous populations have started to consume and switch to polyunsaturated vegetable oils instead of their natural saturated oils from coconut oil, what's interesting is there's suddenly been the incidence of intestinal disorders and immune deficiency diseases actually increased dramatically since they've actually changed. So I've already mentioned enough about this thing about HDL and LDL on the previous one, so I'll skip this particular slide. And we will end with this, because it's coming up to 10 past 8 now, is that I've just hopefully convinced you that lard may be a good option and other saturated fats. And next week we'll be starting on butter, why butter is your best friend. There is something very unique about butter, in fact. And I will leave you with that today. Thank you very much for attending, those of you on Periscope and also those of you on Zoom. Thank you for the hearts, and thank you for attending. This is Austin Byrne-Jones from The Body Curious, and same time next week, that's 7:30 every Monday on Zoom and on Periscope. Health all about fat, your best friends forever. Cheerio.